In the previous voice thread, we looked at the 5 general categories of species, the 5 kingdoms of living organisms, and we discussed what their various roles are in the ecosystem. In this voice thread, we're going to look at several different types of species in terms of, well, what are some specific things that, or some specific information, details about how certain things live. There's still going to be generalities, but we're going to begin to categorize species a little bit differently. You may be wondering what in the world is going on with this bird on this slide, and so I need to give you a little bit of an explanation. I was with one of our on-ground environmental science classes out at the North Chickamauga Creek Greenway. This is a field trip that we take in lab, and there happened to be a gentleman down there by the name of Dr. David Aborn. And Dr. David Aborn is in the biology department at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and he is an ornithologist. He studies birds. And he was out there banding birds, and this was extremely exciting. He was very, very gracious in sharing what he was doing with the class. This was completely unplanned. He had several birds already there at his station where he was measuring them, and so the students got to watch him actually gather data and see the kinds of data that was collected and observe how he handled the birds. And then he invited us to come back to his mist nets. And so this magnolia warbler is caught in this material here. This is called a mist net. Now, mist nets are extremely soft and supple. They're very, very fine. In fact, it was kind of neat that it came out as clearly in this photograph as it did. It doesn't hurt the birds at all. They get tangled up in it, that's for sure, and they can't get out. And it does take a bit of finesse to get them untangled from the net. But in general, you just don't see any injury to the birds, and the researcher, in this case Dr. Aborn, was able to easily untangle the bird because he's got a lot of experience. It would have probably taken me an hour. And he collected the bird and put it in a mesh bag and took it back to the station where he was working and took down the information and brought the bird back and let it go. So the bird was perfectly okay. We get a lot of good, important information on it. And when the bird was let go, he had a metal band on his leg right there with all kinds of information. And then later on, somebody else might capture that bird, and they would have that band, and they would be able to go online and find out when the band was applied and get information about it, so we can begin to track what's going on with these birds. And so that was a very exciting thing that just happened to be serendipity when we were on a field trip out at the Greenway. The first type of species that I would like to introduce you to is a type of species that we call a keystone species. Keystone species. Now, in order to understand what's going on with a keystone species, you kind of have to know what a keystone is. And this comes from architectural engineering. And back in ancient days, the Romans actually figured this out. They figured out how you could take stones and put them together in such a way that you could make this structure called an arch. And you didn't need mortar or cement or anything like that to make the arch. They would stay up dry. But what made the arch work was this stone right here. And that stone is the keystone. And what it does is it directs the forces that are holding this arch up in the way that they should go, and that's what holds everything up. So what do you think would happen to this arch if you took the keystone away? Well, what's going to happen is the arch is going to fall down. It's going to collapse. It won't be able to operate correctly without that one particular piece in place. That's a lot like what a keystone species is. A keystone species is a type of organism, a species of organism, whose activities have a lot of influence. This organism's activities influence the activities of many other organisms. A lot of other organisms, in other words, a lot of other organisms depend, either directly or indirectly, on what the keystone species does. Our example that we have right here that you've probably noticed is a bee. Well, of course, what do bees do? Well, bees sting you, right? Well, only if you bother them. No, bees do a lot of very important things in the environment, and a lot of other organisms, including people, very much depend on what the bees do. Okay, so we can see that this bee has visited a flower, and so while he was in the flower, he was gathering some food, gathering nectar, and look at what got on his body. See all these little spots right in here? Okay, that's pollen. And that bee is going to fly off and go visit another flower, and in the process he's going to transfer the pollen. We call that pollination. And that's very, very important because that's how the plants reproduce. So many, many plants depend on bees to move their pollen around in order to produce seeds and reproduce. Very, very important to the plants. It's not just about producing seeds and reproducing, though. I mean, where do we usually find seeds? Well, seeds are found in fruits, like apples and oranges, things like that. You find seeds inside of fruit. Well, why are there seeds inside of fruit? What do the fruits do? Well, fruit is how plants get around. It's how plants disperse. It's how they move. It's how they get their seeds from one place to another. And in many types of plants, fruits don't form unless pollen is present as well. The pollen has kind of a dual role. It allows the seeds to form in reproduction, but it also allows the fruit to form, and that's how the plants get around. Well, how do the seeds get around when they're in a fruit? Well, something eats it. So fruit is an important source of food for a lot of other animals. And if the bee didn't carry the pollen to the other flowers and pollinate the plants, then the plants wouldn't make the fruits, and the fruits wouldn't be available for other animals to eat. See how this is starting to get kind of involved? In addition, of course, the bee was down there in the flower, and he was drinking nectar. So nectar goes in the north end of the bee, and what comes out, actually the north end of the bee, when he gets back to the hive, they regurgitate that nectar into certain cells in the honeycomb, and then they fan it with their wings to evaporate the water. And while it was inside the bee, it got mixed up with various chemicals and so on. And as the water evaporates, that regurgitated nectar turns into honey. You probably didn't really want to know that, did you? But now you know where honey comes from. It's basically alterated bee barf. But that honey is very important. It's important to the bees. It's important as a source of food. It's important to a lot of other organisms as a source of food as well. Let's get back to human beings. Oh man, bees are really important because there are a lot of crops, especially orchard crops like apples and almonds in California and other types of plants like that, apricots and peaches, etc., that are bee pollinated. And so the farmers depend on the bees to pollinate those crops so that the farmers can make a living, and that's a part of our food supply. So bees are really, really important. A lot of organisms depend on bees doing what bees do. Bees are an excellent example of a keystone species. The next type of species that we want to look at is called an indicator species. And they're called indicator species because, well, one of two reasons. The first is that they indicate something about the environment, and the second is they indicate whether or not changes are taking place in the environment. Now, I happen to have a picture of a yellow warbler here. Yellow warblers are indicator species. They're what we call migratory birds. They winter down in South America, and they summer up in Canada, and they happen to fly through Tennessee during the spring and during the fall on their migrations. And remember the magnolia warbler we had on the first page of this voice thread, and we had an ornithologist putting bands on it. And one of the things he's doing is he's studying what happens as these migratory birds come through and go back. And over the years, people have noticed that the number of birds returning in the spring has been going down. And they've wondered, why is that happening? Well, it happens because something is going on in their winter habitat down in South America that's reducing their numbers. And so these birds are indicating something is wrong, something is happening. And now we know what's happening is their wintering areas in South America are being cut down. We talk about the cutting down of the rainforest, so tropical rainforest deforestation is a problem, and that problem is showing up. We can see what's happening because these birds are not coming back in the same kinds of numbers. So that indicates that something is happening in the environment. There's a change in the environment. Another important type of indicator species is something called a frog. Okay, well, you've all heard of frogs, I'm sure. I'm trying to draw a little frog here. There's our little froggy. And frogs are important indicator species because they tell us about things that are changing in the environment. We're finding that frogs are becoming more and more scarce in some places, or frogs are having problems. Amphibian populations, as a rule, are declining, and it's thought that that's because of climate change or because of things that human beings are putting into the environment that's causing a problem. And we can tell that there's a problem because the frogs, which are good indicator species, are not as happy as they were. They're doing worse, and so now we know that actually he's a little sad frog because things are changing in his environment. Put some little tears on him here, and it's because of human activities. So they indicate that something is happening. Indicator species indicate that something is happening in the environment. Another way to think about indicator species is they tell us about something, about the environment itself. So, for instance, there's a type of plant called a cactus. Okay, if there is a cactus growing, where do cacti usually grow? Well, they usually grow in the desert. There's one particular kind of cactus that looks kind of like this. Got arms like that, and it kind of goes up like that, maybe up like that a little bit. This is a kind of cactus that grows out in the desert, very tall. And when you see this kind of cactus, which is called a saguaro cactus, you know that you are in the Sonoran Desert, because the saguaro cactus only grows in the Sonoran Desert. Okay, and so it is an indicator species of the fact that you're in that particular ecosystem. Now, another example, maybe not quite so extreme, there is a tree that grows here in the eastern United States, in the southeast, and very common all over Tennessee, called a sycamore tree. Sycamore trees are very distinctive because their bark is bright white color and it flakes off of the upper branches. You can see them from miles away. But you only see sycamore trees, usually the only place you see sycamore trees growing are along bodies of water. Sycamore trees need plenty of water. They grow in places where their roots can get down to the water table, where it's very wet. So they grow in floodplains and along the banks of creeks. So whenever you see a sycamore tree, That tells you that you're in a floodplain situation, that you're in an area where the water table is fairly close to the surface so the sycamores can get to it. So they indicate what kind of ecosystem you're in. So indicator species, they tell us when things change, and they tell us something about the ecosystem itself. Generalist species. That's the next kind of general type of species we're looking at. Haha. A generalist species is one that lives in lots of different kinds of locations. It can tolerate a wide range of conditions. You can think of it as having a very wide optimal range. They grow anywhere, they live anywhere. In the case of an animal, they can eat anything. They eat lots of different types of food. They can live in lots of different types of habitat. They do lots of things in their environment. And these are called generalist species. This time of year in Tennessee, you see a lot of these little purple flowers in your yard and in the woods. These are common blue violets, and they live in a lot of places, and they can grow under a lot of conditions. They have a wide range of tolerance. They don't necessarily eat anything, but they can grow in lots of different places, and they're very, very, very common. Another example of a generalist species that we also have a lot of here in Tennessee. We have this kind of big furry animal, and he's got a long tail, and he's got cute little ears and whiskers, and this is a possum. Oh yeah, we talked about possums back when we talked about when we were talking about entropy. Okay, possums, they're generalist species. They can live in a lot of different kinds of places, eat lots of different kinds of food. Possums, raccoons are another example of generalists. Things like cockroaches and rats and mice. Generalist species. They can live anywhere, eat lots of different kinds of things. They have a wide range of conditions under which they thrive. In fact, come to think of it, there's another type of generalist species out there, another species that is a generalist that can live just about anywhere and eat a wide variety of different kinds of food, and can it just has a really wide range of tolerance. Can you think about what he is? Let's see, we got possums and raccoons and cockroaches and rats and mice. Oh, how about human beings? Humans are generalist species as well. The next type of species is exactly the opposite of a generalist, and we call these guys specialist species. They do just the opposite of generalists. So generalists, if they can live anywhere, do a lot of different things, eat a lot of different kinds of foods, get along with a lot of different kinds of organisms, specialist species have very narrowly defined roles. They only do certain things. They only live in certain types of habitat. They only eat certain kinds of foods. They only interact in certain types of ways. We can think that they have a much narrower range of optimal conditions. Okay, the range of tolerance for a specialist species might be considerably smaller than the range of tolerance for other species, especially for a generalist species. The example that we have in this page of the voice thread is an organism called a spicebush swallowtail butterfly. And this is the caterpillar of the spicebush swallowtail butterfly. And boy, he's an interesting looking guy. I took this picture out at Fall Creek Falls State Park over on the Cumberland Plateau in Middle Tennessee. And boy, it looks very kind of scary and kind of frightening. It's interesting that these structures right here that look like eyes are not really eyes. They're just spots to make you think they look like eyes. His real eyes are these little beady things here on the top of his head. But anyway, spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillars are specialists. And what they specialize on is what they eat. Spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillars only eat one kind of plant. What kind of plant do you think spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillars eat? Well, hopefully you said spicebush. Now, spicebush is a plant, it's a very common plant here in Tennessee, that is a member of the same family as sassafras and other plants like that. It makes chemicals that are in its leaves and stems that actually smell pretty good. That's where it gets its name, spicebush. But they don't taste so good. And most organisms, most herbivores that would want to try and eat these guys, well, they have a lot of trouble with them. They're hard to eat. The spicebush is hard to eat. The chemicals give them an upset stomach. They're just not very tasty. And as a result, the spicebush doesn't have to worry about getting eaten by most organisms. But the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar, it likes spicebush, and it can handle those chemicals that are in the spicebush leaves, and as a result, it's got a food supply all to itself. Nothing else eats the spicebush, so these caterpillars have it all to themselves. We say that they specialize on spicebush. Can you think of some other organisms that especially animals that specialize in doing just one particular thing, especially when it comes to food? A couple of them come to mind. How about the koala bear? Koala bear. Koala bears only eat certain species of eucalyptus. How about the panda? Okay, pandas only eat certain species, only eat bamboo. They're specialized for that. That's all they do. If the koala bear can't get eucalyptus, if the panda bear can't get bamboo, if the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar can't get spicebush, what's going to happen? Not good. So the problem with being a specialist is that kind of leaves you vulnerable. That kind of leaves you wide open to potential problems if something happens in the environment that affects those specific things that you do. If something happens to the eucalyptus, the koala bears suffer. If something happens to the bamboo, the panda bears suffer. They're very vulnerable to changes. So it's actually kind of an advantage to be a specialist. That gives you options. It gives you diversity. It allows you to do a lot of different kinds of things. Whereas a specialist, well, it's fine if conditions are nice and constant and don't ever change. But if something changes in the environment, specialist species often have a little bit of trouble. If you think about it, well, how many of you have ever seen one of these guys, one of these spicebush swallowtail caterpillar butterfly caterpillars? Not a lot of people see these. Well, that's because they're not really all that common. And, you know, is the world just overflowing with koala bears? Are panda bears everywhere you look? No, they're not. On the other hand, cockroaches and mice and violets and dandelions and stuff like that, they're all over the place. Generalist species tend to be very common. Specialist species, not so much. Another interesting type of species and kind of the basis of some of my doctoral research is a type of species called an endemic species. Endemic species. These are organisms that, for whatever reason, have a very restricted geographic range. They only live in one particular area, or they have a very specific habitat type. So you might be thinking, well, endemic species sounds like they might be specialist species. Actually, it turns out that's not necessarily the case. And understanding the causes of endemism in organisms is a really fascinating branch of ecology and biology. And it's one that, well, we really don't understand all that well. It's not as straightforward as you might think. An example of an endemic species, this particular picture we have right here, is of the Tennessee milk vetch. You probably didn't know we had our own milk vetch. It's a very pretty little plant. It grows in a very specific type of habitat called a cedar glade, and more specifically, it only grows in cedar glades that occur in Middle Tennessee, in the Central Basin physiographic province of Middle Tennessee, really in the area around Nashville, Murfreesboro, Lebanon. That region right in there is where the Tennessee milk vetch is found. I took this picture at the Long Hunter State Park in the Bryant Grove Recreation Area near Percy Priest Lake over in Rutherford County, just south of Mount Juliet. Now, cedar glades, I guess I'll put the glades up here. Cedar glades are really interesting because they have a very high rate of endemism. There are 26 plants that are found in the cedar glades in Tennessee that are found nowhere else in the world. Okay, so this is a very interesting phenomenon, and when we study these cedar glade plants, we wonder, what is it about the cedar glades that makes them the only place where they grow, or what is it about the plant's biology or ecology that makes them only grow in the cedar glades? You'd think that would be a fairly straightforward question to answer, but it turns out that it's not. And we really don't understand a lot about what's going on with some of these cedar glade endemics and a lot of other endemic species as well. There are certain areas of the world and certain types of places you can go. If you're interested in endemic species, you go to these particular types of places and you'll have endemic species all over the place to play with. And the main place you go to look for endemic species, you go to islands. Islands are hotbeds of endemism. You go to the Hawaiian Islands, there are lots of animals found on the Hawaiian Islands that aren't found anywhere else in the world. And in fact, Hawaii boasts over 600 species of fruit fly that are found nowhere else in the world. So if you're ever in Hawaii and you're sipping your tropical exotic drink with the little umbrella in it and a fruit fly starts buzzing around, don't swat it. It may be a brand new species unknown to science, and that might be the only place in the world where that poor little fruit fly lives, and you sure don't want to be the one to squish it. Places like Australia. Wow, Australia, endemism. Think about what's there. They got kangaroos and wallabies and wombats and Tasmanian devils and all those kinds of things. Lots of things that are found on Australia, found no place else because they're islands. So we say they're endemic to Australia. Madagascar, great movie by the way, if you haven't seen it yet. Madagascar is another island that has a tremendous amount of endemism. Lots of things found on Madagascar that are not found anywhere else in the world. Now that's not to say you have to go to an island to find endemic species, as we see with our Tennessee milk vetch. They can be anywhere, but if you really want to study endemism, you go find yourself a good island someplace, and chances are you're going to find something there that's not found anywhere else. A topic that is of particular interest to me is the issue of exotic species in the landscape. Now, before we really start talking about exotic species, we have to understand another term called native. Native species versus exotic species. Okay, what do we mean by these two terms? And these two terms are related. A native species is one that is a natural part of a particular ecosystem. Native species develop with the ecosystems that you find them in. And so they have established a particular set of interactions. Can't emphasize enough how important interactions are. They've established the interactions, and they are an integrated part of their ecosystem. And as a result, native species are under the influence of various checks and balances on their population. Okay, checks and balances. So their populations don't get out of control. There's diseases, there's predators, there are limiting factors in their ecosystems that keep native species under control. An exotic species is an organism that has been moved from its original ecosystem. So it started out as a native species someplace else, and it gets moved into a new ecosystem. Now, there's some issues with this. Sometimes human beings do this on purpose, sometimes we do it accidentally. One thing that can happen when we bring in a species into a new ecosystem is that as long as we take care of it and maintain that species, it will live and survive and be fine. But as soon as human beings quit taking care of it, it dies off. And if that happens, well, that's not really such a bad thing, and we can deal with that. It's not really going to be a problem. Another thing that can happen is humans can bring a species into an ecosystem where, remember, it doesn't have any interactions. You know, that first scenario, the organism did not establish any interactions, and so that's why people had to take care of it. In the second scenario, the organism does establish interactions. It sort of becomes integrated into the system. Checks and balances develop to help maintain their populations. I call those types of exotics naturalized. We say that they're naturalized into the ecosystem. Plants like daisies, little oxeye daisies, chrysanthemum, leucanthemum, you find those a lot along the roadsides in the summer. They're not really bad things in the environment, but they are exotic species. But they have established interactions, and so we regard them as naturalized. They have sort of become incorporated into their new ecosystem. The third possibility, though, is the one that's really scary. And it is exemplified by this species right here in our picture called privet. Sometimes the new exotic organism gets introduced into a new ecosystem. There are no checks on its population. And it finds that for many of the things that it requires, it's right there in the optimal zone. It's got plenty of light, it's got plenty of water, it's got plenty of sun, it's got plenty of nutrients, but it doesn't have any diseases. It doesn't have any predators. And the next thing you know, its populations take off. And when this happens, we say that the exotic is invasive. An invasive exotic species. And privet is one such thing. And when an exotic species becomes invasive, then it can have a significant impact on the ecosystem that it's invading. It can cause a decrease in biodiversity. It can cause extinction of native species. All kinds of problems get caused when an exotic species becomes invasive. Not all exotics are invasive, but the ones that become invasive can really wreak havoc on an ecosystem. Here in southeastern Tennessee, in the Chattanooga area, Hamilton County, this bad boy right here, privet, that's probably one of the most destructive, invasive exotic species. It alters the landscape, it alters the ecosystems in tremendous, tremendous impact. Other invasive species would be things like Japanese honeysuckle, kudzu, which a lot of people have heard of. Things like the European starling caused some real problems with some of our songbird populations a while back. Certain kinds of insects. Right now we're battling something called the hemlock woolly adelgid. that may very well bring about the destruction and near extinction of the eastern hemlock tree, a very important component in the forests of the eastern United States. And in another 20, 30 years, they could be gone from this little bug that we brought in. Doesn't have any natural controls, and it takes off. Now, if you think that's being a little melodramatic, wow, we could lose this entire species in 30 years, and it was going to have a profound impact on our forests. Well, we know what we're talking about because it's not exactly the first time it's happened. One of the big examples of what can happen when an exotic species comes in is what happened to the American chestnut tree. The American chestnut tree used to be one of the most abundant species in the eastern forest, in the whole eastern United States. And they're all gone. I mean, for all practical purposes, the American hemlock is ecologically extinct. A fungal disease was introduced, an exotic species, in the early 1900s. By the mid-1900s, the American chestnut was essentially gone, and that had a profound influence, a profound effect on the forests of the eastern United States. The hemlock adelgid, the insect that's attacking the hemlock trees, many people believe this is going to be as bad, if not worse, than what happened to the American chestnut trees 50 years ago. Invasive exotic species, they are a huge issue. And in fact, that's what your graded discussion question is about.